Welcome back, everybody. Social Studies in Isolation. We are just getting to the last week here of Mustache Madness. We're down to our final four now, so we have four characters left. The voting is in. There was four landslide victories that took place this past week, and so you'll see on the bracket that we have up here on the screen, we have Theodore Roosevelt getting a big victory, Walt Disney getting a large victory as well over Martin Luther King Jr., Ambrose Burnside Falls, evidently the crazy mustache was only able to get him through one round. Mark Twain is going to move on there. And then finally on the bottom, the good guy wins here. Mahatma Gandhi is going to take out Joseph Stalin. So we are down to our final four. So today we will go through those four. We'll square them off, and then finally we'll have our championship later on in this week. So let's get right to it. So we're going to start once again with the one seed that is left here, Theodore Roosevelt. So today's focus for Theodore Roosevelt, we talked about kind of his hunting and his adventurous side last time. Today we focus on his military expertise. Theodore Roosevelt was always a military-minded person. When he went to Harvard, we talked about him being in Harvard earlier, his main focus of study was the Navy. He actually wrote a book. He just studied the Navy and the way it was used in the War of 1812. After he gets out of college, then he gets into the political life, and he is eventually in 1897 appointed as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley. An important event takes place during this time. Off the coast of Cuba, which is right off the coast of the United States, the U.S. ship called the USS Maine explodes. And many people at the time blamed this explosion on the Spanish. And one of these people to do so especially was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, after the explosion takes place, he sends out messages to the naval forces saying that we need to prepare for war. McKinley is trying a diplomatic solution, but Roosevelt and others basically force his hand, and we get involved in what is known today as the Spanish-American War, the war between America and Spain. Theodore Roosevelt is going to resign his position as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy pretty much immediately so he can go fight in this war. He is going to create what is known as the first U.S. Voluntary Cavalry Regiment. He creates this with another gentleman, and this becomes known very famously as the Rough Riders. Volunteers flood to join this cause. Everybody wants to fight with the great Theodore Roosevelt. The volunteers rush in, they get trained, and they most famously are known in this war, the Spanish-American War, at the Battle of San Juan Hill, when he takes the Kettle Hill. He leads the forces through open battlefield, and against all the odds and against what all the experts would say, he charges through open battlefield towards an entrenched group of men with repeating rifles. He takes the hill, they win the battle, and the Rough Riders become very famous, and even more so, Theodore Roosevelt becomes very famous as the man that led this cause. After the war is over, he basically asked everybody to refer to him as Colonel Roosevelt, or the Colonel, is in short for that. So he definitely is focused on this. He eventually becomes president, as we can talk about in the championship round if he gets that far, and he's very much obsessed with the Navy still. He is going to have his big stick diplomacy, which is essentially his idea of we will talk to people diplomatically, we'll speak softly, but we will carry a big stick, meaning we will have a massive military buildup to back us up. And so he is going to rule in a way of having a massive naval force. He eventually gets out of the presidency, but not before he wins a Nobel Peace Prize for actually ending a war between the Russo-Japanese War. And then at the age of 58, he is a retired president at this point. He is going to volunteer to lead 200,000 men in World War I, continuing his love for the military. He is never called upon. At the age of 58, he certainly would have been a fairly old man to lead them into battle. He's never called upon, and unfortunately for Roosevelt, who was always such a proponent of using the military, his son Quentin is going to die in World War I, and really changes his perspective a lot. His kind of pro-war, pro-military side is going to be pushed away a little bit. So that is Theodore Roosevelt's military side of things. Once again, if you want to hear about his presidency a little more, we'd have to move him on to the championship round. Roosevelt takes on Walt Disney, who also has gotten a lot of votes throughout this. So we focused last time on Disney's time in World War I as an ambulance driver, illegally because he wasn't old enough. Now let's talk a little bit about why Disney is famous. Obviously, Disney is famous for his animation. So after he's done in World War I, he is going to move back to Kansas City, and he's looking to get a job as a cartoonist for a newspaper. He's unable to do that, but instead becomes an artist for advertisements for magazines and movie theaters. So he gets his foot in the door a little bit there, but he still is interested in the entertainment world. In 1922, he opens up his first studio called Laugh-O-Gram, and within a year, it fails and it collapses. He then decides to try again. He moves with his brother Roy out to Hollywood, and they start another group as a part of Universal Pictures. He creates a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And Oswald the Lucky Rabbit is actually Disney's first character, contrary to what many people think. But what happens is he leaves Universal Pictures, and they own the rights to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and so he has to leave Oswald behind. With his new studio, then he creates the very famous character we all know today, Mortimer Mouse, later known as Mickey Mouse, and his first short film in 1928 of Steamboat Willie. After Steamboat Willie and Mickey Mouse becomes more famous, Walt Disney takes over his voice. He is going to be the voice of Mickey Mouse for many years, and he is going to use that to kind of launch himself into other endeavors. His next big famous endeavor is his attempt to create a movie called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Everybody is ridiculing Disney, saying this is ridiculous. A full-length color feature film like this is never going to work. They call it Disney's folly. They think it's going to bankrupt him, and they couldn't be more wrong. When Snow White is released, it receives $8 million in its first release, which is equivalent to $130 million today. It wins the 1938 Academy Award, in which he actually got a large Academy Award and then 7 small ones to show his Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. For 2 years, he actually holds the Technicolor patent, meaning he is the only one that is allowed to make full color movies at this time. And this propels him into a career, and as you know today, the huge Disney empire and what it is today. Of all the characters he creates, he famously has all these wonderful, he says that Goofy is actually his favorite one that he has. So if you want more on Disney, you'll have to move him. So Roosevelt and Disney squaring off there. On the other side of the bracket, then, we have Mark Twain and we have Mahatma Gandhi. So for Twain today, what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of talk about some of his famous quotes and writings that he has. So we all know Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. We talked about that a lot. Some of the things Twain is known for are not necessarily things that always fit into his books, but they're just big quotes that we know the father of American literature for. So he was very much a comedian of sorts. Many of his lines are going to be funny. For instance, he says, "Giving up smoking is the easiest thing in the world. I know, I've done it thousands of times. Never put off until tomorrow what you can do the day after tomorrow. And buy land, they're not making it anymore." And then a couple of them, not only are they supposed to be funny, but they are also insightful, and they're providing some sort of wisdom. It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And then finally, one of my favorites, "It is better to keep your mouth closed and let people think you are a fool than to open it and remove all doubt." So Mark Twain has all sorts of one-liners. I encourage you to look up even more of these. There's a lot of phrases we use today that Twain came up with. We don't even realize that he came up with. Kind of the same as Shakespeare, which you all evidently hated and voted out in the first round. Sorry, Shakespeare. A lot of common phrases we use today were invented by these people a very, very long time ago, and we don't even realize that's where they came from. So that is Mark Twain. So if you want to know more about his writings and his information, you'd have to vote for him. And then finally, to finish up the semifinal rounds, we have Mohandas Gandhi. So we focused last time on his early time as a lawyer and then moving to South Africa and starting to his civil disobedience movement. Today, we talk more about what happens when he goes back to India. So he returns to India after 21 years in South Africa, and he brings his idea of peaceful, nonviolent protest to India to fight against the British. A little background. India was a colony of Great Britain, much like the United States were a colony of Great Britain before that. And Gandhi looks at it and he says, we want independence, just like a lot of people have had. This is a long time after American independence, so they want independence. But they don't think they can beat the British in a war. He says there's no way, and the only result would be massive bloodshed. So let's use peaceful, nonviolent protest instead. But he's not just fighting for independence for India. He fights for women's rights. He fights for religious rights. He fights for the group called the Untouchables, which were the bottom, the dirt of society in India. He pushes for everybody. He wants everybody to have equal rights, not just the upper class that he actually comes from. He's going to live by example through his proceedings. He actually has a famous quote saying, "You must be the change you wish to see in the world." And he very much lived in that way. He lived in a manner that he was going to act by example. So when he's fighting for the poor, he lives amongst the poor. When he pushes this idea of we should only use Indian products, things made in India, he is going to refuse to wear British clothing. He only wears homespun Indian cloth, in other words, made in India. He only uses Indian products. He believes nonviolence towards everything, so he's going to be a vegetarian. In fact, at one point in his life, he goes 5 years eating nothing but nuts, seeds, and fruit. It's not really good for his health. He eventually goes to a more complete vegetarianism, but he does stays away from meat because the treatment of animals is part of his movement as well. And he advocates this for all of his people, and he gets a huge following of thousands and thousands and thousands of people who love him. They refer to him as Bapu, which basically is father, or Gandhiji, which is more of an enduring term for Gandhi. And they follow him and they do whatever he tells them. And when they don't, he's going to act accordingly. So when they move to violence in some situations, he is going to fast. That is one of the ways he makes his points. So his followers started using violence against British authorities. He doesn't like this. They won't listen to him. So he says, fine, I'm not going to eat until the violence stops. And he goes as many as 21 days without eating any food. And he's on his deathbed. He's about to die, and his followers get right back in line, and they stop the violence and they go back to the peaceful ways. And that is when he is going to come out of his fast. So there's a whole bunch of different great examples of the Salt March and the Salt Works Factory and all these different great things we can look at. And if you want to learn more about what Gandhi is going to be doing in action, you can vote for him to move forward to the championship as well. So there's your 4 people that are left: Theodore Roosevelt, Walt Disney, Mahatma Gandhi, and Mark Twain. So as usual, make sure you vote. This doesn't work very well if we don't vote. So get out there, vote, and hopefully we'll have a great championship round later on in this week. So have a great day. As always, stay healthy, stay safe, and make sure you tune in next time for Social Studies in Isolation.